To the 2 o'clock session, connecting the dots, hopefully, between cult undue influence and what we used to call mind control and brainwashing to the whole human trafficking phenomenon. My name is Steve Hassan. We have amazing panelists. Many of you know me because of books that I've written, like Combating Cult Mind Control and Freedom of Mind. Some of my panelists said I should show my former pimp, Sun Myung Moon and his wife. It was a very powerful presentation this morning by victims of Moon. And I'm just going to go to the continuum that we will use later. So many of you know that I've been doing this work for decades, and I have encountered people born in the children of God who described the flirty fishing and the happy hookers for Jesus, people who were victimized from childhood up. And I, over the years, saw documentaries on human trafficking. About 6 years ago, I was introduced to Lisa Goldblatt Grace, who founded My Life, My Choice in Boston, which is an anti-trafficking group. Met with her for lunch, gave her a copy of my book. Nothing happened. And then last summer, I got a call from a volunteer for the Human Trafficking Task Force in California, someone who had read Combating 10 years earlier, who said, "Hey, Steve, I'm doing this thing, and I read your book, and it dawns on me that pimps are like cult leaders. What do you think?" And I said, "I think so too, but to be honest, they've never sat down with survivors and interviewed them and really found out the nitty-gritty." And he said, "Would you be willing to come to California?" And I spoke with Carissa Phelps, who is a runaway who was victimized, eventually went through the system, became a lawyer, and got her MBA from UCLA. Check out runawaygirl.org. I should say I'm a runaway girl now, officially, because Carissa invited me to do a training for 600 law enforcement people out in California last summer. Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, police chiefs, etc. That's where I had the pleasure of meeting Rachel Thomas and Zelita Miller and a number of other survivor mentors. And I've been immersed this last year in studying human trafficking, and my eyes keep getting wider and wider because it's a fit. In my professional opinion, it's a commercial cult. Many pimps use religious language and symbology as part of the grooming and indoctrination, but it really is a system of lack of informed consent. And does everyone have the handouts of the adapted bite model for human trafficking, which is on my website as well, so you can get more copies, freedomofmind.com. But if you take a look at it, the only difference between the traditional bite model and the one for human trafficking is I had to add things like kidnapping, drugging, gang raping, stabbing, branding, beating, torturing, murdering, threatening to kill family members. So more extreme, and as Alan Shefflin indicated in his landmark talk that Rod Dubrow-Marshall was so kind to read, we're moving away from the term brainwashing to extreme undue influence when we're talking about human trafficking victims. And the dual identity model completely fits. Many victims are given new names, new clothing. There's a whole grooming, seduction process that parallels involvement into religious cults and therapy cults and business cults, and the incorporation of the cult identity that's dependent and obedient to the authority figure. The loaded language stood out for me when I was listening to the survivors, because many of them were using language that I think reinforces the cult mentality, as opposed to calling it what it really is, which is, for the most part, sexual slavery or labor slavery. So we can go through a lot of the bite model in terms of it, but in the interest of time, and because I've added 2 more speakers, I think you should really hear from the people who know this so personally and experientially. And I would like to introduce my collaborator, Rachel Thomas, and it's Rachel's curriculum to help victims of trafficking that I've been honored to be participating and collaborating with you on. When I heard your story, I was like, that's the closest story to my recruitment into the Moonies when I was 19 at Queens College. So with that, if it's okay, I'll pass the microphone to you.
Thank you. And I'm a little bit loud, so I'm going to try without the mic, and if it doesn't work, let me know. Okay. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay. What an awesome conference. Steve, thank you so much for the invitation. I had no idea what to expect, but how fascinating all the information, how heartbreaking all the stories have been, and how inspiring all the survivors and to hear everything that's being done. So it's a whole new world for me, and the 2 worlds resonate, cults and trafficking. So a little bit about me. I'm Rachel Thomas. I'm from Pasadena, California. Everybody heard of Pasadena? Woo! Okay, good. The Rose City. It's a beautiful city. I'm from a wonderful 2-parent, upper-middle-class home. My mom's a lawyer. My dad is a deacon. I was raised Christian. Never experienced any type of abuse. My parents have been married over 30 years now. I've never even seen them have an argument in front of me. Wonderful. I mean, I played sports in high school. I was voted prom queen. Just the perfect American childhood. And I worked really hard in school, and I got into the college of my choice, which was Emory University in Atlanta. Anybody heard of Emory? Yeah, okay, because we don't have a football team. So, sometimes people are like, oh, that doesn't count as a school. But it was a good school, okay? And so I was in my junior year. I had just turned 20. And I was at a local college hangout, and a man came up to me, and he said, "You are gorgeous. Has anyone ever told you you should be a model?" And so I'm like, well, what girl doesn't like to hear that? And so I said, I've tried it before, and I'm in school to be a teacher. I'm almost a senior. Thanks, but no thanks. And then about half hour later, 2 girls came up to me, and they said, you know what? We're here with Mike, that agent who approached you earlier. Can you just come talk to us for a second, please? And so I went and I sat at their table, and he proceeded to tell me how he's the #1 modeling agent in Atlanta, and that he's been doing it for a long time, and he knows talent when he sees it. And he believed in me so much that he wanted to invest in my modeling career. He was going to pay for my first photo shoot and pay for my first set of comp cards, which is the model's resume. And that he guaranteed he would get me my first modeling gig in 1 month, paid. And if he didn't, then, what have I lost? It's all his investment. And if he did get me that first paid modeling gig, then I would sign with his agency. And so that was night 1. I decided to give it a try. And we have so many other wonderful speakers I can't wait to hear from. So I'm going to give you guys the 3-minute version of how my story went. So that was night 1. By week 1, that very next weekend, he got me my first photo shoot, professional photo shoot. Everything was legitimate, professional hair and makeup. It was wonderful. He was polite. The other girls were nice. Week 2, he got me that first paid modeling gig. At the end of, there was a music video shoot, and he asked me to fill out a W-4. And I had worked at the YWCA in high school, so I knew what that was. And so I filled it out with my permanent address, which was my parents' home address in Pasadena, California, my current address where I lived with my roommate and best friend near campus, my social security number, some other information, and I gave it to him, assuming I would receive my check in the mail, and didn't even think twice about it. By week 4, he had gotten me 2 paid modeling gigs. I was in a magazine, and he was saying, the look and you're blowing up, and so I was experiencing all the success and it was fun, and so I decided to sign with his agency. And I agreed to pay him a certain amount of money for him to represent me. And then by week 5, we were driving to an audition, and Michelle, one of the girls who had approached me the first night, who was one of his other models, who was on billboards and magazines and commercials, she was driving. Mike was in the passenger seat, and I was in the back seat. And a song came on the radio, and Mike said, "Hey, I like this. Who sings this?" And for whatever reason, Michelle, I don't know if the music was too loud or if she was zoned out, but she didn't respond. And Mike reached over, and he slapped her so hard that her head hit the window, and she started apologizing. "Mike, I didn't hear you, I'm so sorry." And having never seen abuse, I was stunned in the back seat. But what I was thinking is, oh my God, this is like one of those Lifetime movies that I used to watch, and that must be her boyfriend, and he's an abusive boyfriend, and she needs to break up with him, and I better get away too. And so the very next morning, in my sweetest voice, I called and I said, "You know what, Mike? It's been so nice knowing you. Finals are coming up, and it's getting really hard to juggle school and modeling. I just want to go back to school. You know, we can just kind of nullify this contract. If I ever want to pick back up with the modeling, I'll call you. Thanks, but no thanks for now." And he was silent for a moment. And then the next words out of his mouth were, "Bitch, I own you. You owe me, and I will get my money. You're going to do what I tell you to do, or somebody's going to get hurt." And then I heard him ruffle some papers, and he read off my parents' home address. And that was when I realized that the W-4 I'd given him, he kept. And he said, "Do you understand?" And never having heard of trafficking, never experienced abuse, being from a very sheltered, loving home, I said I understood, but I didn't. And he said, "Good. Meet me here tonight." And he told me where to meet him and what time. And when I got to the location, he was waiting there with another man, and he said, "You're going to take care of my friend tonight." And I saw the way the man was looking, and I knew what he was insinuating, and I started crying. And I said, "Mike, please do not make me do this." And he just grabbed my arm very tightly, and he said, "I told you you're going to do what I tell you to do. Don't make me hurt you." And he forced me to have sex that first night with the buyer. And when it was over, I was traumatized, I was crying, I was scared. And very calmly he said, "What are you crying for?" And I was like, "Is it not obvious? You just, this is not what I signed up for. This is not right." And he said, "Were you a virgin before tonight?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Why are you wearing that cross then? According to your religion, premarital sex is a sin. So you've been sinning all along. Don't act like this is anything new for you." And in that moment, it was a mix of shame and a little bit of truth in his words. And from that night, for the rest of the year pretty much, almost a year, I was under this man's control. And as Steve goes over the bite model, and we'll talk about that more, every form of abuse, and at the forefront was psychological abuse. And traffickers, pimps, are expert manipulators, just like cult leaders. They are narcissistic psychopaths. And so for me, he knew that I was raised from a Christian home. So he would say that he heard from God. He would quote to me Romans 13:1. "Be in submission to all authorities, for all authorities in your life are placed there by God." He'd say, "You signed a contract. I own you for a year. You're going to do what I tell you to do. God put me in your life to teach you a lesson." And so, in addition to physical abuse, sexual abuse, all types of abuse, I was subject to that before, thank God, I was able to leave the situation. But for other girls, if they were raised without a father, then he would use that angle. So I think that when we think about trafficking and cults, traffickers can be a spiritual daddy, and talk about polygamy. Other girls working for the same pimp are called wives-in-law, like a family atmosphere. So I think my time for right now.
But just say a couple of words about, you put the perp in jail with the FBI.
I think. Well,
And just mention the curriculum and some of the work you're doing. And then we'll move on.
yeah, and I mean this is a part of the story that I had to come to terms with myself because I was so indoctrinated, so believing that he had sent me here, or that God had sent him here to teach me a lesson, and so subservient that I didn't go to the police. But after about 4 months of working with him, I had done music videos and magazines, and I was on a local billboard in Atlanta, and I became his poster child. So I was the one that he would say, go tell that girl she's beautiful and that she needs to meet your agent. And so one of the girls that I had been forced to recruit in had my cell phone number, and she had the courage to go to the police months after she had been brought in and was forced to do everything I was forced to do. So the police called me, and they said, you have been named as an accomplice to a trafficker. Come down to the station. Either you tell us your side of the story and you may be a victim, or we're going to put a warrant out for your arrest. And so when I went to the station, it took a few days to convince them that I was also a victim. And I did some undercover work. I testified to the grand jury. I was placed in witness protection where I read Heaven's Harlot and
About the Children of God cult.
And it helped me to understand that I wasn't the only one. And when they finally arrested him, they put his face on the 6 o'clock Atlanta news, and they said, if this man has ever approached you, if you have any information about him, call this hotline number. And in the first hour, they had over 75 phone calls. Wow. And it turns out he had been doing this for 7 years in Atlanta, and there's a 15-mile radius of 6 colleges: Georgia State, Georgia Tech, Agnes Scott, Clark, Emory, and Spelman. 2 of those schools are all girls' schools. And he would go to each one, handing out his business card saying he was a modeling agent. He touted himself on being a multicultural modeling agent, so he had white, Asian, Latina. I was the only African-American girl for a while. And this type of operation is not how most trafficking victims are lured in, but it's definitely not uncommon. And having over 75 victims, he was a cult leader, you know, and had never been exposed in 7 years. He was able to do this without anyone ever exposing him. So what we do now, I guess we'll do that now.
No, you can just mention it, and then we'll go around and we'll cycle around.
Okay. So when I was introduced to C last year, I read Combating Cult Mind Control, and by the time I was done, the pages were like worn thin because I had highlighted almost 90% of the book for all of the psychological manipulative techniques that had been done to me. And so I approached him about co-authoring a curriculum, because a lot of trafficking victims are still full of love or attachment with their pimps. They run back. The recidivism rate is about 14, especially for a minor. When they're arrested or put into a group home, they run back, come back, run back, arrested again, go back. And so we have to stop that. And so we're teaching
The recidivism is higher.
You mean they return 14 times?
14 times, I'm sorry, did I say 14%?
That's enough.
We just didn't understand.
Thank you. 14 times is what we're seeing. And so we piloted our curriculum at the beginning of the year, and if you want to learn more about it, we have a few handouts, and we have comments from some of the participants.
And it's on your website and my
it's on
website.
The website too. And
It's called Ending the Game, because pimps call it the game.
right. Yes.
And they write books about how to brainwash the hoes and recruit and use other victims to recruit
Symbology.
victims.
This is one of the main books. I mean, it's such a
It's horrendous.
topic. It's just like cult mind control is, but there are so many similarities, and I think we'll
Thank you.
talk more about it after. But thank you guys for listening.
And I don't know if you were here for the earlier session in this room where Christine gave her story in depth. Now we're going to get a smaller lens of amazing story of courage.
Hold it right up to your mouth.
And turn it on.
It's best when it's on. Okay. All right. So I was...
Would you mind standing up some
right.
people in the back so
Okay.
they can't see? Thank you, dear. Thank you.
I joined the mainstream Mormon Church when I was 18 years old. I had a relatively beautiful life as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I had a rocky marriage, however. I ended up getting divorced, but I was a very devout Mormon mother. So now I'm a single Mormon mother, and I lived in Michigan where there weren't very many members of the church to date. I ended up dating outside of the church and getting involved with my boyfriend. We had intimate relations, and I was not a hypocrite, so I knew that I needed to confess. I confessed it to my bishop, and ultimately I was excommunicated. During the excommunication process, it was very humiliating, and it was a breakdown. They call it the repentance process, and it made me. It was really difficult for me because I was one of those true believers. So I did everything I could to get back into the church, and I was rebaptized. So now I was extremely committed to obeying every single rule. I'm a mother with 4 children. I had a college degree. I was Young Mother of the Year. I was Mrs. Michigan once. I wasn't a vulnerable teenager looking for religion. I had my thing. But I had a dream one night about who I should marry. And I saw a picture of someone. I saw somebody in my dream who I later saw at a singles dance. So I thought it was evidence that this guy was meant to be in my life. Well, luckily for me, he happened to be a narcissistic psychopath who played on my dream and had a history as a con man, but I didn't know. And he portrayed himself as the new Mormon prophet. And to make a long story short, there's a culture of obedience in the Mormon church, and if you don't, it's very legalistic, and if you don't follow the rules, there are consequences, either, through this church court that you sit in, which is very horrible, or in eternity. So now that I had met the new prophet with the culture of obedience in my training, in my experience, that I needed to listen to what this man said, I became his spiritual wife. Then he took another spiritual wife, and I got demoted into the second wife, and I was like a slave wife. And before long, I had playing on the things that he knew I was already hurting over, such as humiliation. He used that as a tool to justify having me do other things and putting me in a situation where I was commercially sexually exploited. And when it was over, the way I got out was one of his accomplices. There were other believers and how that I thought were believers. One of his accomplices came to the room where I was, which was in a hotel for mostly where men just got out of prison. Okay, and my children at that time were visiting their father, so none of this affected them, except that afterwards I was dissociating a lot and trying to heal, but they weren't involved in the actual witness anything like that. But this accomplice had a change of heart and started crying, and he came clean, and he told me, and he said, the prophet is not a prophet. He's a con man, and all of us believers, none of us are believers. We're all atheists. So my entire cult experience and polygamy experience was a hoax to manipulate and exploit me because I was so determined to serve God. And when I recovered when I got out of that, I was really messed up. I did not understand what happened to my brain because I had been like a normal person beforehand, I thought, right? But I didn't know what to say. I was homeless. I'd lost everything. I lost my dignity. I lost my possessions, my money, my dreams, and my eternal life. I mean, I was really, really fractured. And so the only way I could really process it was to not think about it and pretend it didn't happen for a couple of years. Then I was reading the newspaper, and I saw this story about Elizabeth Smart. And the couple that had kidnapped Elizabeth Smart followed me a lot as well, and I had a daughter, Brian, the same age. And I always thought, what are they? I see them everywhere, you know. And then, but when I read this story about Elizabeth Smart, one of them, I read them because Brian David Mitchell had this manifesto that he had written, and he said he'd received it from a messenger of God. And I had, my particular prophet had written like all these revelations, and it was similar content and misspellings and everything. So I was like poring over every one of those stories to say, I think my guy trained him. I mean, that was my theory. I can't prove that, but when I read one of those stories, I read a comment by a guy named Hassan. Did I say it right?
Yeah.
And he had this, and I went, oh my gosh. It was the first time I could like approach trying to figure out what happened in my brain. And so I called him, and I got 2 phone sessions. And during that time, he said, "Get my book," and I got it, and I read it, and I was like, "Wow, this is I." So I'm not. I thought that there was something wrong. I thought maybe I was on the autism spectrum or anything, because I did not know how I could have fallen for that, right? I mean, I actually got tests to see what was wrong with my brain, that I could have fallen for that. And so his book made me realize that any brain of any person, that could happen to them in the right circumstances. I mean, I was so much of an advocate of this book. I lent my book out so many times. It never came home. Can I have a new one?
I'll give you another. I'll send you
and
one.
I told
Thanks for the plugs. That's the least I can do.
Yeah, and so when I first got rescued, I did go to the police, and I made a statement. I made a number of them, and but they didn't. I wasn't validated as a person who really deserved any. I didn't even get a victim's advocate, and they never investigated any of the witnesses, and I continued to be harassed by my guy. So I when I moved to California, there I kept being screened for Ptsd because I kept having flashbacks, and then I came across somebody who said, you might be a victim of trafficking. And even though it wasn't right away when I got out that this happened, it was a matter of a few years. But the fact that I was still suffering from it, and I didn't understand it. So I went to she referred me to this company called Cast LA, and then I screened, and I qualified for services as a survivor of trafficking. Not the typical, so not as you could tell. I mean, most trafficking happens to to children and young women, not women with 40 children. How about 42 hours? No, but it does happen because trafficking is also about labor trafficking.
Yeah.
And it can happen to anybody, and it can happen through religion. And that when I qualified for services, I didn't really need them at that time other than therapy. But the thing that excited me was to think, wow, this is exactly what happens to the women in polygamy. They are through spiritual blackmail and threats and trauma, and and physical abuse or psychological coercion, they do not have the free will, and they fit the bite model perfectly. And so I'm very honored to be here, and I'm going to pass it along because...
Kim, is it okay if we let Christina talk in? So I want to just say that I took moderator's privilege and invited a new participant who came to Ucla, and we were talking for hours last night, and she said, I founded the second oldest anti-trafficking group in America, and
I was born and raised in the Children of God cult. So thank you, Steve, for having me here. This is my first time at this kind of conference. I've, up until last year, avoided reading anything about the Children of God, reading anything about cults. I heard about this conference, and I emailed Michael Langone, and I told him that for years I've been making a list of the similarities between what happens to a cult victim and what happens to a trafficked victim, and I would, could I present a paper? And he said, well, you have to read this abstract by Steve Hassan. And I read it, and I'm like, oh my God, I read about the bite model. I'm like, this is insane. It's so similar to so many things that I put on there. And, mind control, the fact that you work around the clock, you never get paid, physical abuse, you name it. I could go on and on. You guys have the bite model in front of you. Everything applies. And so I was born and raised in India and lived in South and Southeast Asia until I was 20 years old. And when I was, growing up, I was definitely a rebel in the cult, and so I was the subject of a lot of punishment, and I was put in isolation multiple times. I was given exorcisms. I was made to change my name several times. So my name's Christina Arnold, and it's actually my third name, and I don't care anymore. It doesn't matter. But they do that on purpose to make you change your identity. And they would say, you're possessed by the devil, and you need to start a new life, and, these are all the things that are wrong with you, and psychological coercion and control and manipulation and emotional abuse were some of the main things.
And can I just say the obvious thing for people who know about the Children of God was that Berg was a pedophile who victimized children and sent the women out. And they even called themselves happy hookers for Jesus, and they did flirty fishing.
Yes.
So, and when I first learned about trafficking, that was my only equation directly to people who had been through that experience, to trafficking. And now I meet you.
It's amazing. Serendipity. So I used to watch my mom getting ready at night. She would tell me, I need to take care of my younger siblings and put them to bed and give them dinner because she needed to go out flirty fishing. I knew exactly what that meant. A year ago, I decided to start doing some research as part of my master's thesis. I was encouraged through years and years of therapy, and my therapist and then also my thesis advisor both said, sort of around the same time, they said, your work in trafficking and the fact that you grew up in this cult, I think that it would help you if you would be out about your story, and I think it would give more credibility to your work, and it would explain to people why you started this organization and why you do the work that you do. And also, it would help you to integrate your two selves, because I lived in constant fear of being found out and being outed as a person who grew up in a cult, because I thought, people would, there was a lot of shame involved. And, now I realize that it's not my fault. I didn't choose this. My parents did. If anything, they should be ashamed. But my parents are still in the cult. I have 20 siblings. And so I've managed to help a couple of them get out. And the work that I've been able to do in trafficking, I started Prevent Human Trafficking in 1999.
That's the name, preventhumantrafficking.org.
That's right, preventhumantrafficking.org. And the reason that I started this nonprofit was because, as a friend actually said, she said, you know, you had to find a group of people that were more messed up than you were to go and help. And the truth is, I was too close to the abuse and everything that happened in the cult to be able to help any cult friends or other people get out. I just had to get out and try to survive. And so through these missionary trips that they would take, we were exposed a lot to, you know, extreme poverty and extreme abuse of other, you know, children, like working in rock quarries and working as domestics in people's houses. There was a girl that lived a couple doors down from us in this one house, and she burnt a shirt that she was ironing for the lady that she worked for, and the lady took the iron and, like, branded her face. I saw kids who had battery acid poured over them because it was a matter of an honor. It's not an honor killing, but it was a punishment along those lines. Children working in rock quarries and being prostituted and all this stuff. And so, you know, I remember talking to people about this and them saying, well, you know, this is their cultural practice. Like, we don't get involved. This is their culture. And just thinking there's something fundamentally wrong with this whole situation. And the older I got and the more insane the beliefs of the cult got, the more I realized I absolutely needed to get out. But like trafficking victims, if you don't have access to your passport, you don't have access to money, you don't have anywhere to go live, what do? So for years, I kept trying to figure out, how am I going to get out? And finally, through a total accident, my dad left my grandparents' address out, and I wrote to them, and I told them everything that had been happening, and they had no idea. You know, they hadn't been in touch with my parents for 35 years. And I wrote to them and I said, you know, if you'll give me, send me a plane ticket, I'll pay you back. I just want to leave and I want to go to college and I want to have a life. And so they did. They sent it to a neighbor's address, and I got the ticket and left, and was on welfare in New York for quite a while. I arrived barefoot and pregnant, as they say. Just kind of a series of unfortunate events. But the work that I've been able to do with human trafficking has been a way, you know, for me to be able to relate in a way to these victims that other people can't really relate to. So in the trainings that I do for the U.S. Attorney's Office, for example, in Washington, D.C., or for embassy officials, I'm able to talk to these victims, and I'm able to explain, you know, the issues of force, fraud, and coercion in a way that is only theoretical to them. You know, they haven't lived it. So this is actually the first time, other than my presentation for my thesis, that I've ever told my story out loud. I'm hoping that, you know, me being able to be out about this will help me help more victims. Thank you.
How do you follow that?
I don't think I can.
Go ahead.
Not
Because
as
you got an
a
amazing.
victim, at least that's for sure. I'm gonna go ahead.
Introduce yourself, or would you like me to? Would you mind standing?
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
I usually talk pretty softly.
Can you stand, Kimberlyn?
Okay, a little personal background about me, and I'm going to follow my script because it's a little easier, and I don't want to confuse everybody.
Can you put the mic to your mouth?
I grew up in an apocalyptic Bible-based cult founded in the 1930s by Herbert Armstrong, known as the Worldwide Church of God. Married in the group, raised 3 children in the group, and then we left. My husband and I left after 40 years, nearly 40 years. You know, my early formative years were molded by the narrow, paranoid rantings of the church's leaders and strict adherence to literally interpreted biblical principles and directives. When my husband and I left, we left in the 90s after coming to the conclusion that much of what we had been taught and had been living no longer had a hold over our thinking or our faith. This was a time of significant introspection, existential crisis, and then regrouping on many levels. This led us both to go to seminary. I had an intense desire to figure out what I had believed, figure out what my own concept of God was, and figure out where I was going to be going. During that time, we both became professional clinical counselors, and I have to say my experience now, many, many years later, is bound in a narrative where meaning flows and stigmatizing memories are minimal. Still there, but minimal. And my understanding has, and lived experience in the group provides me with a deeper awareness of issues at play with both the cult and the human trafficking survivor. So having said that, I'm currently the director of the Campus Outpatient Alcohol and Other Drug Program at Beachbrook, which is a residential treatment facility in Cleveland, Ohio for severely emotionally disturbed children. My professional background does span about 17 years and has included working in community mental health and substance abuse programming, and families and children are my focus, although I do maintain a very small private practice on the side working with folks that have been in cults or are in the process of leaving a high-demand group or relationship. So what I'd like to do now, my story's a little drier, a little more clinical than everyone here, but I'd like to walk you through and tell you the story of a young domestic trafficking victim and her journey in treatment. This is not an exhaustive study, but largely anecdotal observations and information based on my work with adolescents in treatment where there is a confirmation or strong suspicion that the adolescent victim has been trafficked. We don't always know. When they come into our treatment facility, we many times think this is what's happened. We can put the puzzle pieces together and wow, this sure looks like it, but we are never completely sure. And so the children that we work with includes children with whose environments, behavioral disturbances, substance use, and emotional vulnerabilities do place them at risk for being trafficked. So after they leave our facility, we worry that they are going to end up in the hands of a trafficker. In my department at Beachbrook, training on mind control, destructive influence, coercion, and thought reform is now included in regular supervision trainings. And understanding the severity of trauma that has resulted from repeated intrusive long-term abuse, socializing the victim into submission is critical in understanding how to work effectively with a victim of trafficking or a victim of cult abuse. And then I'll end with a little, if there's time, a brief reflection on the similarities between cult leaders and traffickers, and there is a handout circulating on that, so if you don't get time, it is available. 16-year-old Shannon was picked up by the police high on drugs and soliciting sex on the street. And after her arrest, she became suicidal and was admitted to the hospital. She was not taken to juvie. She was put directly into the hospital because she was so suicidal. Shannon spent the first years of her life with both mom and dad, who were drug addicts. And Shannon witnessed domestic violence between mom and dad, often cowering in the corner while all of this was going on. Dad left home when she was 7. She never saw him again. Actually, he is a murderer and he is in jail now. She did not learn about this until much later. Mom's drug habit included exposing her 2 children to drug dealers and boyfriends, some of whom were sexually abusing Shannon. Mom eventually lost custody of both children, with the county taking permanent custody, and Mom is not allowed contact with either child. Shannon was placed with an aunt, and she ran away. She wasn't going to live with her aunt. She wasn't going to stay. She was intent on getting out there and being where she wanted to be. She ended up linking up with distant family members involved with prostitution and illegal drug activity. One of these distant cousins became Shannon's boyfriend, and he convinced her to sell herself to other men. He gave her material items, what she thought was love, and drugs. And in the meantime, she contracted several STDs and had at least 1 miscarriage. While in the hospital, initially when Shannon was picked up, she totally refused to give any information about her circumstances. And she just kept repeating over and again, I just want to die. Over and over again, I want to die. When she was received in our residential treatment facility, we put her on a mood stabilizer and an antidepressant. And our assessment phase, we use a number of fairly simple but well-known instruments to try to determine just exactly where this child is in terms of PTSD and depression and so forth. We use the UCLA PTSD Index, the Childhood Trust Events Survey, the DES, the Dissociative Experience Scale for Adolescents, and John Brier's MDI, which is the Multi-Scale Dissociation Inventory for Children. And along with our clinical interviewing, it was very clear this child was totally shut down, relationally numb, and walled off from all of her emotions. Secrecy is a trademark of sex trafficking victims. Shame and stigma leads them to conceal their involvement. And working through the trauma of their experience is the last thing on their mind. They don't even feel as though they've been traumatized. But when people go at them, what's happened to you? Why are you doing this? Who are you involved with? A child of 16 years old or 14 and 13, 12 in some cases, they're not going to say anything or very little. And my own experiences of being raised in a high-demand group has sensitized me to the developmental implications of destructive influence, including fear-based manipulative methods by parents, caregivers, and group leaders where the child's uniqueness, creativity, and free will are all subjugated to the demands of the caregiver and group. And I have become aware of the development and construction of a split and false self, or a pseudo-self. Shannon had begun developing this false identity based on her worth coming from her value as a sex object from a very young age. And this made her highly vulnerable to the ploys of a trafficker looking for a low-maintenance, easy, high-profit victim. And her mother had contributed to this process in that she was an enabler figure needing to maintain her drug habit. And Shannon eventually did reveal the existence of her boyfriend. And she clung to this relationship for months in treatment, always with the hope he would be waiting for her at her discharge from our facility. She missed what she thought was the love and affirmation she had never experienced before, and she was unable to understand the exploitive nature of the relationship. Her thinking remained magical and delusional for months into treatment. Her therapist, educated and sensitized to the effects of coercion and mind control on the developing young person, understood the importance of providing relational safety and holding the ambiguity and conflicting emotions that Shannon presented day after day. The therapist understood that overwhelming interpersonal abuse led to her being immobilized by her internalized fears and triggers. Shannon's history of traumatic attachments fueled the most serious trauma reactions, and she was walled off from a core identity and sense of self and lacked any sense of agency. And she dissociated using primitive defenses, including projection, repression, projective identification, pretty much continuously in most of her interactions with folks at our treatment facility. The therapist understood the trauma bond with her boyfriend and allowed Shannon to pace in therapy at her own pace. She paced with the therapist in a way that continued to help her feel safe with the therapist. And she started to slowly focus on school and goals that were things that she'd been too distracted and that were unavailable for her before. And her grades made dramatic improvement. But out of school, she continued to have episodes of suicidal regression and periods of intense acting out, destroying furniture, assaulting staff and peers, and so forth. And eventually, Shannon's episodes began to decrease, and she was able to begin working on processing her story or developing her narrative at her own pace with the support of her therapist. She started putting words on her experiences, but it took months and months and months just to get her to this point. She began to identify feelings she was completely and previously detached from, including loneliness and feeling abandoned. I remember when the therapist told me the day she said that she felt lonely and abandoned was very profound. And it brought tears to the therapist's eyes, and she just felt, how can I help this child? How can I give her what she should have had all along? as a natural course, a course of development. She ultimately was able to construct a trauma narrative that, although somewhat superficial at first, it did provide a coherent picture of her life. And that was very important for her to be able to understand and connect the memories in her life up to this point was important for her. She began to identify shame and guilt feelings that were overwhelming and confusing to her too. So she was able to get words on these feelings that were very important in helping her understand why her behaviors were what they were and what was happening to her. She continued the process of integration into more normal activities of a young teenager, learning social boundaries, healthy peer relations, and group involvement. But she struggled with triggers out of her consciousness, and she regressed into several dissociative breaks that left her suicidal. The episodes seemed to be triggered by unconscious memories of a lifetime of relationship trauma. This really wasn't true psychosis in the sense that we normally think of psychosis, malingering or conduct disordered behavior, but the direct result of her trauma history and the disconnected presentation that she had. This is how complex trauma presents in an exploited adolescent who has experienced many kinds of repeated abuse. And during the course of her treatment, John Brier's multi-scale dissociation scale for children was re-administered, and it did provide some clues in helping the therapist track Shannon's personality integration. A significant regression occurred later in treatment when Shannon did stop taking her medications. For some reason, she decided, I wasn't taking medications anymore. I can get better on my own, which in some ways was progress for her. But at the same time, she really did need them. She had been on a small dose of a mood stabilizer and antidepressant, and she had begun getting too close to feelings that were making her feel very frightened and vulnerable. And she did have a serious suicidal gesture requiring hospitalization. When she got out, we started to integrate art and music therapy into her mental health treatment in a more intense way, and she was able to begin working on her feelings and emotions at a different level, and she started to really come around at that point in the next few weeks and months. And she's now begun to label her experience for what it was. Like a cult exiter, she had been used, abused, and exploited by people she thought cared for her and loved her. And she was finally able to say the word trafficked. This was a word that she was able to say on her own. The therapist did not prompt her with it. She had come to the point where she realized she had been sold. Her worth was sold. And this was a fairly significant time for her. Her therapist stayed with her, has been able to work with her very patiently. And she's also been able to uncover an identity that she realizes is her true self. It was there all along, but was hiding under a false self. This was constructed in defensive reaction to her abuse and her trauma. And so now I'd just like to kind of give a sense of comparison between the cult leader and the human trafficker. And there is does everybody have a copy? Or some people, I think there's 30 copies. Okay. All right, this is not.
We can get more copies later if you need one.
And this is not Cult 101. This is just a simple comparison between in the context of Shannon's story. Who is the abuser in a cult? Who is the cult leader? It can be a family member, medical figure, friend, religious leader, educational, political figure, or the person next door. So who's the human trafficker? It can be a family member, employer, immigration facilitator, lawyer, drug dealer, or even a former victim moving up in the organization. For Shannon, was a distant family member, became her boyfriend, trafficker, and controller. What's the hook to get the victim into the system? The cult leader will demonstrate acute interest in the victim's well-being, as your story, Rachel, was reminding me of that. Promises safety, housing, black and white answers to life's questions. Prospect feels like his needs or her needs are understood and his well-being is paramount. In Shannon's situation, Shannon's boyfriend took care of her physical needs, including providing her with drugs, posed as her boyfriend. And she felt totally protected, wanted, loved, and special because she did not have that in her formative years, her very early formative years. How is the victim held in the system? Once bonded to the group or the leader, use of fear and threat of sanctions, such as if you leave, you'll go to hell. Your life will be in danger. Your family will suffer, etc. Cult control of sexuality and intimacy, decisions on who the person has sexual relations with, forced abortion, sterilization, etc. In Shannon's case, she was expected to engage in sexual prostitution when told to and give the money to her boyfriend. At times, she was passed around to various associates of her boyfriend and told to have sex with their customers and then returned to her boyfriend controller. She was told to lay low, don't talk to anyone, only do what her boyfriend wanted her to do, and she wouldn't get into trouble or hurt. She was physically assaulted several times when she asserted independent needs. In fact, when we first got her out of the hospital, she had bruises all over her face from an assault by her boyfriend. Key levers for maintenance in the system, intermittent use of rewards and affection, fear tactics on the part of a cult leader. In Shannon's situation, under her controller, boyfriend, she was rewarded generously, but only when her boyfriend wanted to, with drugs, jewelry, and most importantly, quality time with him. She craved that attention, and she looked forward to it when she got it, and that was what kept her with him. Shannon is one of the very fortunate ones. She was picked up by the system, placed in some very expensive treatment, and we will be following her for a long time in treatment foster care with the same therapist. This is the ideal. It doesn't happen very often, and we wish it would happen more, but that's what I wanted to kind of just expound on today, is just exactly what we do with adolescent traffickers who are able to get the treatment.
That was fantastic. And not only did I meet Christina last night, but I also met Halle. Is that pronouncing your name correctly? And I was been blown away by hearing a little bit about your expertise and your work. So if you don't mind taking 5 to 7 minutes, as the professional you are.
Contributing to this amazing panel of women, Steve, I really appreciate it. A bit impromptu. I had mentioned prior in speaking with Christine about my background, I came into this work by way of more international human rights-based work and working with torture survivors and refugee camps, activated within me by transgenerational means, I think, from my family lineage being Middle Eastern. I spent several years working in acute conflict zones and war zones with severe tortured women, children, and men. And
A little closer to you.
And also, by proxy, a byproduct of the refugee experience is also that many refugees being in a vulnerable situation experience and are subject to trafficking in all sorts of forms, from organ, labor, intrafamilial in the form of child brides, so on and so forth. It's quite extensive. But I worked for several years internationally in the human rights law sector, as well as a trauma-based psychiatric kind of forensic approach. And domestically, my work translated also with refugees and their children. And I had a practice in Oakland, and I worked with a lot of, we had a South Asian division, a lot of Cambodian, Mien, Thai, Laotian, specifically Khmer Rouge survivors. And their children, born in East Oakland, having no connection to the culture, don't speak Khmer. It was very fascinating to see how this kind of unconscious genocide trauma was manifested in these youth transgenerationally. The girls were all recruited, exploited sexually. One of the highest percentages of that specific culture in Oakland. And the boys, rage like I've never seen. They'll shoot you point blank in the face. They don't need a posse. They don't need a color. The gang, it's past just traditional gang violence. It was rage. And it was a very fascinating kind of cultural phenomena. So that kind of evolved. But the point of bringing that piece in there was, when I was working with these kids, it reminded me, especially the girls, I came across an array of different backgrounds, Trafficking, especially domestic trafficking, not just foreign national trafficking. There's this kind of construct of the willing victim and the real victim. You know, Katya from Ukraine is a real victim, but my little Keisha from East Oakland, because she's African American or Latino, well, she's out there because she wants to be. That's the stereotype and the internalized racism that these children experienced. And in working with them, their stories and their experiences herald that of the refugees and the torture survivors I treated overseas, from traumatic brain injury, sham and mock executions, mutilation of various parts of the body, beatings, injection of unknown psychotropic substances, you know, you name it. The gamut was almost identical. So that part of my trafficking work evolved to really acknowledge trafficking as a form of torture. And then it kind of came into another tier when I met Christine Marie, whose story with the intersection of cults and trafficking was just now bridging this all together. It was mind-blowing. It was amazing. I'm like, okay, not only are these many survivors of these cults torture survivors, but the trafficking, the intersection of trafficking and torture, and many of the things you mentioned, you know, I was just jotting down. I mean, the grooming period, like the love bombing, you know, the severe psychological manipulation, you know, using psychospiritual, emotional, vulnerable points to kind of just erode the person's narrative, you know, completely reorient their locus of control, wearing them down with all sorts of various tactics, which I know Steve he could share. And I mean, the domestic violence cycle with that kind of intermittent love and abuse. I mean, just so many parallels, but that has really deepened our work, and also bringing the cult awareness, the education and Steve's work to train these prosecutors and these AGs and the feds and the ICE agents and the community organizations to understand that this level of torture trauma, in my opinion, and trauma bond needs this type of intervention and tactic that your community is so seasoned in addressing and honoring. You know, it's wonderful to be here because it's just a given, your understanding, which is so nice. I'm not having to justify and re-explain that part. That is so understood and so appreciated and refreshing. Thank you so much. And we hope to depart that to the trafficking community and the wisdom that is in this community. We need your collaboration and cross-pollination. It's an imperative new relationship that we've built. And thank you for your stories, your wisdom, your experiences.
Thank you so much. And basically, the people who are the most effective at helping victims are survivors. Because they know the language, they know the mindset, they can share their experience. And when I did the training, the 4-hour training, what they were missing was, like, I showed pictures of Charlie Manson, Jim Jones, Sun Myung Moon, Moses David Berg, L. Ron Hubbard. I connected the dots because one of the Achilles heels of destructive undue influence mind control, right? If you're in it, you don't see it, but you can see it elsewhere. How could you follow those weird people? But then you go to the bite model, and it's the same thing. And so you can kind of go around the back door, in a sense, and start building an intellectual framework. You were talking about narrative therapy yesterday. A new story for what is this all about, and give people the hope that you have 2 masters, right, Christina? 2 masters. Wow. So we're going to have 20 minutes, and I would love to open it up. I know each one of you could do another round. This has been so phenomenal, but I'd like to open it up to questions and maybe get a little bit deeper. Yes, Paul?
Can somebody offer a definition of trafficking?
Can somebody offer a definition of trafficking?
Keep using the word, but no one said what that means. No.
So the quick federal, and it is a federal crime, for sex trafficking, it's causing a person to engage in commercial sexual exploitation by use of force, fraud, or coercion. And when we're talking about a minor, 17 or under, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. If any child is engaging in commercial sexual exploitation, whether it's exotic dancing, pornography, prostitution, anything, then that's trafficking. And I know it was said during the earlier session, but I just want to add one thing. The language is so important in helping that mind shift. So anytime you're talking about a child, a minor, a juvenile, a teenager, it should never be in the same term, child prostitute. Because if you're not legally able to consent to have sex until you're 18, how could you legally be able to consent to sell sex when you're not 18? So child prostitute has to leave our vocabulary. And I'm so glad we haven't heard it here today. And it's so refreshing to be around people who get it. So I hope
So
that.
does trafficking always involve sex, or is there other kinds of forced
There's an
labor?
umbrella. It's sex and labor trafficking.
Right.
Oh, so the question was, does trafficking always involve sex? Trafficking is the umbrella, and there's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And labor trafficking is slavery, forced labor, for no or very little pay.
And there are criteria that the UN has that fits a lot more criteria, and by that UN definition, I know that we had a handout earlier,
Yeah.
maybe we can get that. But I was a labor traffic victim in the Moonies by the UN's definition.
Absolutely. In our previous workshop, we talked about some of the myths. I'll just say that for those of you who weren't there. Human trafficking does not require transportation or movement between countries or states. Human trafficking is about compelled exploitation. So it can be done with force, but it's not always force, fraud, or coercion, and that includes psychological coercion, and religious blackmail is psychological coercion. Mm-hmm. And it could be slavery, involuntary servitude. She covered sexual exploitation, but it can also be. There's a number of other things, and we have some handouts that we'll get more copies of. But if you have if you have force, fraud, coercion, deception, abuse of power, as part of the process by which you were compelled to do these things, then consent doesn't even matter. So if you consented to be in that cult in the beginning, that consent is rendered invalid the minute there was coercion or you tried to leave and they wouldn't let you.
And could you give that to Christina? Christina, could you say about the Obama initiative about anti-slavery? And
Sure. So
could you stand up, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
So President Obama a couple of years ago enacted an act, and it is primarily to go after the production side of any sort of goods. So, for example, Thailand, I just was at the Trafficking in Persons rollout. They release a report every year in June. And Secretary Kerry introduced it and started talking about the fact that Thailand has been put on Tier 3, which is the lowest tier that you can be on, and you get economic sanctions for that. And the main reason is because they have such a problem with slavery, labor trafficking at sea. So they're the third largest exporter of shrimp in the world, and basically this act is addressing any sort of goods. So I've got something on my website it's called the slavery footprint. So you can take it and you go through it, and it tells you basically, a lot of the goods and services that you consume, you might not think about it, but those things were produced with slave labor. And so it's to punish very severely companies and now what you're finding, and anyone along the production line. So now big companies like Gap, other Walmart, Forever 21, you name it. There's a very long list of companies that need to look at their supply chain And it's if they're in any part of their supply chain, there's slave labor, then we're supposed to have boycotts and severe penalties and punishments. So that's been a big step forward.
Okay, question?
I just wanted to, I work with children. I've spoken to most of the ladies on the panel. One of the things I'm very interested in, and I want
Do you want to take the mic if you're going to?
Well, no, it's okay. I think everyone can hear me. I just want to congratulate you so heartily.
Just take the mic, please, quickly.
So I just want to congratulate you on your.
You need to have it in
How
your mouth.
articulate you've all been. I'm just blown away, and I'm not sure. I'm a psychiatrist. I don't know if there's any other colleagues in the conference, but I just want to represent the fact that I know we need more education in the area of psychiatry and in the area of treatment. And I work in residential treatment for children. I'm a child psychiatrist, really, but I've also treated adults. And one of the things that I think needs to be pointed out that you've actually said, but I just want to emphasize it, is that with adults, for instance, you were already a college student, I'm not sure, in 1920. So your brain was formed. You had a certain amount of internal reserve of the love, and the developmental steps had been achieved. So for you, I think, and I'm not going to minimize the trauma and the horrible things that you went through. It sounds horrifying. But with children who are introduced to this from, either born into it or they're introduced to it in early or middle childhood, I'm finding, and I work with teenagers who have been abused from anywhere from like 0 to 15, 16, that the brain has been changed to the point where they don't know what normal is.
Right.
Now, I think we should all keep that in mind. The children don't know what normal is, and so the idea, and that's why Kimberly was talking about how difficult and how many months it took. And I can tell you, I'm working in a facility where one of my colleagues actually said 80% or more of the children have been sexualized and abused, and that we are not seeing it and calling it what it is. That the idea of combining the trafficking concept with the abuse, with the domestic violence, all of these concepts, they are actually they are so commingled that we need to look at this as a total picture and of what it's doing to children. And I think that's I think your panel has really done a lot. Maybe I'm not sure if you are aware of how much you said to me personally, but that, and I'd like to open up further discussions at some point about it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So when thank you for that comment, and I think it ties in perfectly with what Steve said, that survivors are truly in a position to carry the solution. And I think that the more we support and get the survivors to a place where we can be articulate and educated and confident enough to present not only our stories but the solutions that we have in mind for the problems, we're going to see amazing results. And even if all of us have survived something, so even if you're not a cult survivor, and like you said, sometimes I work with girls who have been prostituted by their father from the age of 2, and I'm like, how would you reform that? All of it. Anyway, Steve asked me to share briefly on why human trafficking is the #1 fastest growing crime in the world. Trafficking is the #1 fastest growing crime in the world. In America, it's #2. Anybody guess what #1 is?
Drugs. Identity theft.
Identity theft. Identity theft is #1, but it's #2 in America, #1 in the world, and it's because of internet and media. These are the top 2 factors. So just like the internet has revolutionized business with email blasts and online shopping, and it's revolutionized social interaction with Facebook and eHarmony and dating online, it has revolutionized trafficking, making it easier to buy a human being, making, they call it sex tours, easier to transport one victim from here to here to here to here. So many ways. There are underground cyber websites where someone can say, you can order a victim as easily as you can order a pizza, saying, I want this height, this weight, this eye color, this bra size, and I'm willing to pay this. And there are cyber undergrounds that you need a special login code for, special IP address, and traffickers will get that request and say, okay, you're willing to pay that much for this? I'll get that. And so victims can be anyone. It's not just the Black or Latino girl from the inner city. It's college students. It's whoever.
And hip-hop and pornography.
Right. And, there are more porn addicts in the world today also due to the internet than ever before. But the media is the number 2 reason why trafficking is the fastest growing crime in the world. And we're at our lowest point as far as morality in the media, mainstream media, especially mainstream pop culture, MTV, pop music. The top 10 charts right now, the songs right now are glorifying casual sex, promiscuity, prostitution, stripping,
Pimping.
misogyny. And so it's not hard for a young girl or boy who idolizes Britney Spears or anybody heard of Miley Cyrus and the twerking phenomenon and how her songs are like ode to strippers and ode to casual sex. And Lady Gaga, her #1 hit is Don't Stop the Party, Do What You Want With My Body. That's the hook. And so it's not hard to see how someone with a manipulative plan and a deliberate plan can coerce someone into this lifestyle using all the other forms of coercion as well.
Thank you so much. And I also want to say I get the question all the time, and I'm sure a lot of you do too, is cults. You don't really hear about them anymore, right? Except it's the #2 crime. Commercial cults is the #2 crime, except we haven't connected the dots. And I'm getting emotional. But this panel has been so extraordinary. Did you want to say something else? We have time for 6 more minutes. Yes.
In Queens, there was this whole group of snakeheads. They brought people from Asia, and the wife was Asian, Chinese basically. Her husband was an attorney. They used to bring girls illegally into Queens, and they would, of course, it was for sex, labor. They would have to pay like $50,000. And they said, oh, they'll pay it so quickly in the U.S. Even when they were found, that's part of also what you're talking about trafficking, because they're bringing them here for the labor, because they could never pay off their debt that they're supposed to pay.
Right, that's a scam.
And they lived, because I lived in an apartment building, and one day my neighbor's door opened. She had moved, press moved, and somebody else moved in, and there was a sea of beds, and there were all these people in there, and I tried to get the landlord to just look into it to see what was going on. And they did find that these people were here illegally, and they tried to help. But the bad part is when they take them to the airport, they have people there who get them and release them. Basically, can you go back?
Yes,
So
I can't summarize this for the recording, but basically it's a testimony about how traffickers have been bringing people in to abuse them and manipulating the system and such. And I also wanted to comment that Kimberlyn brought me to Ohio for their Ohio National Human Trafficking Day, and 2 psychologists who work at her facility spoke about the trauma of trafficking, but I was tasked with why a trauma-based approach is insufficient to help people who are victims of trafficking. I have a video of that talk if anyone wants to have more from me. It's on my website. I also did an interview with a labor traffic victim whose daughter had died in Mexico because she couldn't afford medicine, and a trafficker recruited her to come to the U.S. so she could make money so she could get medicine for the rest of her family. Smuggled her in, and she was a labor traffic victim, and now she's a spokesperson for Cast LA, and I have an interview on my website as well. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions.
say that. Is it Christine?
Christina?
Which one? Yeah. About her story, because I was involved with children like that, and I met them in Spain. I was a student, just at a cafe, and then they recruited me, and
days were picking up girls from college campuses, transporting them to Paris, and there you could not leave. So when I was reading here about how the victim was held in the system, one bonded to the group leader use of fear and threats. They told me if I left, my family would be, killed, or I'd be killed. So I had all this, fear of leaving them.
So it's another testimonial about a person who was recruited by the children of God and was victimized.
What made me leave the group after 2 years is the fact that these letters, these low letters, they start putting them in binders and saying that this is takes precedence over the Bible, and something rang in my head. That's not how I grew up. I want my Bible, and I started to tell them that I was leaving. And I eventually escaped. I had to escape because they told me I could leave, but they never gave me any money. They kept taking my money. So they separate you from your family, your friends, and your money.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that powerful testimony. Any last comments? Oh, I wanted to say Halle is a psychologist and a lawyer and a traumatologist and a forensic expert. So, and an advocate, and she has an NGO and an angel. And what's your website? And Voices for Dignity. And
Sowers Education Group, and it's written on the bottom.
Sowers Education Group. And Prevent Human Trafficking. Do you have a website? No website. Freedom of Mind. Do you have a website?
Yes,
Arman, ARMAN-healing.org. And she only practices human rights law. Terrible. Anyway, I want to thank you profoundly. This is precedent setting. Thanks, Ixa. Thanks for putting this together. Thank you.